Okay, so with that, I think we've got all of our attendees. So I just want to thank everyone for joining our webinar on managing the complexity of today's threat landscape. Just want to give a few introductions. First off, my name is Dallas Young, and I'm the Technical Marketing Manager over at Torq. And I'm a cybersecurity industry veteran with over 20 years of experience. And I'll be your moderator for today's online webinar and leading the discussion with our two esteemed panelists. Now, just a few housekeeping items. There will be time for questions towards the end of today's webinar, so please feel free to enter in any of your questions into the Q&A tab throughout the webinar, and our team will be more than happy to respond within the allotted time. Now let's move on to Jason Chan, which is our esteemed guest here. He's a former VP of Information Security over at Netflix and is a key member of the Torq Advisory Board. And he's spent more than 20 years working in pivotal cybersecurity roles. And one of his key positions was leading the information security organization at the video streaming behemoth that we know and love, Netflix, for more than a decade. Now on to Leonid Belkind. He's our co-founder and chief technology officer over at Torq, which offers a comprehensive security automation platform for unifying and orchestrating the entire security stack. And prior to founding Torq, Leonid was also the CTO of Luminate Security, which was a pioneer in zero trust network access and SASE. So with that, let's jump into things and have a discussion with some of the panelists here. Now, they're here to weigh in on some of the challenges that cybersecurity professionals currently face and how to harness the power of security automation to address those challenges. Now, one of the most common themes that we've been hearing time and time again across organizations is that they're having a great deal of challenges on dealing with the exponential increase in threats, yet at the same time, they sort of lack enough qualified people to be able to analyze and triage some of those threats. So starting off with Jason, what was some of the common approaches that you had to dealing with these types of scenarios?
Yeah, thanks, Dallas. I think for me, I'd probably bucket that into three areas. I think the first one, and probably the most important to start with, is you have to, as a security leader, you have to make sure that your team is aligned on what are the most important things to protect and what are the most likely threats that you're going to see. And you need to really align not just the folks in your organization, but your peers and leadership, because everybody knows you can't do it all. I think sometimes we feel like we want to stop everything. It's just not possible. So I think some sort of alignment on prioritization is important. The second thing I would look at is, I think a good exercise for folks, especially when you think about headcount or hiring, is what's the next thing you would do if you had one more person, and what's the thing that you would drop if you had one less person? Because I think that kind of framing gives you a good instinctual reaction to, like, okay, well, what's a little bit less important that we could maybe delay on? Because I always thought it was my job to make sure folks didn't feel overloaded and they felt like they had clarity on what we were really trying to get done. And then, maybe the last kind of meta point would be around, we're talking about the threat landscape, and I would say in 20 plus years, I don't think that landscape has gotten any less complex, right? It only is in one angle, which is there's more issues to worry about. I think we have more and more technology. It's more ubiquitous. I think security is more important. So for me, I think one of my leaders at Netflix actually taught me that, like, humans are generally somewhat resistant to change. Like, change is difficult, but so rather than trying to remain static to prevent that sort of allergy to change, it's really like, how do you train your organization to be more comfortable with it and just to sort of manage the process through it a little bit better? So I thought that for me was a really key learning, because, like, especially in a growing business like at Netflix, it was growing not just in size but complexity in terms of what we were working on. So never really expect things to stay the same, and always try to be ready for what's next.
Oh, love some of those insights there. And sort of moving on, because we have a lack of humans, a lot of times we're going over to more technological solutions. And I figure who's better to address this question than Leonid, our CTO himself, is how are organizations really creating an ecosystem from the best of the breed siloed tools to really help them to maximize a lot of their security posture and connect all these different points together?
To reiterate on a point that Jason brought up earlier, I started my career in cybersecurity back at the end of 1990s, right? And even then, an average enterprise security team had 5, 6, 7 different security tools. What happened since? Has this number stayed constant? No, it has grown as the technological landscape grows, and sometimes we have bigger and bigger and bigger technical stack, as we call it, in the organization to deal with. Now, we could go into a philosophical point of let's read about recent, very well publicized breaches. Did they occur because the organization basically lacked the tool to detect? Usually, the answer will be no. Usually, it was not a problem of, oh, we didn't just have the technical capabilities to detect it. It was about, yeah, we did not have the operational capabilities to connect the detections to the processes, to people, to containment modes, etc. Right? Especially when we are talking again about professional cybersecurity organizations and enterprises. Usually this is where the biggest challenge is, right? It's not like, oh, we just don't have the tech to do it. It's we have a lot of tech and we have a lot of smart people, but these things don't necessarily combine together. So I firmly believe that even before we start talking about automating and orchestrating things, let's talk about the needs to integrate things, right? Make sure that our systems can talk to one another. Make sure that alert event finding brought up by one system can find its way to a place where it's not lost in a huge pile of other events. And that goes, by the way, to the other point Jason made, and that's prioritization, right? So this is sort of like, in my humble opinion, the fundamental piece for it all. Can your organization orderly collect and process various security findings, orderly make security actions, block this, contain that, etc., available where they are needed, etc. And that, by the way, is the first challenge that many organizations don't necessarily succeed at. If you do start putting these things in order, however, now we can talk about processes, because now you have the building blocks that you can start building your processes on top. And this is where your velocity and your ability to actually deal with the events that you deem as most important, do this in a way where things do not fall between the chairs. That's where the magic, if you will, starts happening.
Makes sense to me. So after you have your people and processes generally in place here, I know the next most difficult thing is, hey, I've got all these widgets, best of breed solutions. They're all firing off alerts left, right, and center. How do I prioritize and understand what threats I should be focused on the most? And how do I combine the near infinite threat intelligence sources to help me prioritize those threats with the most pressing items at hand? And I think this is where Jason's experience at Netflix is really going to shine. So what are your thoughts here, Jason?
Yeah, I would, if I sort of backed up a little bit, I think that's one of the precursors to that is making sure like you've put your organization into the context of like who are the threat actors that are interested in what your organization is dealing with and why. So and a lot of times there you're going to be hypothesizing, because it's not like the bad guys sort of tell us that they're coming after us and why. So you have to sort of reason about that through threat intelligence and research and learning from incidents that you're seeing, not just in-house, but also externally. So for me, in terms of like what's most important, I think, to Leonid's point, we have a lot of data, and we have a lot of data, we have a lot of systems, we have a lot of tech. So for me, I like to think of security as a context problem, where for folks to act and sort of operationalize findings, they need to know for example, who owns this code repository? Who's responsible for this system? Is this application internet facing? Because that's going to drive how you're going to respond to things and how quickly you need to respond to things. So I'm a big fan of sort of, as you're preparing your environment, making sure you understand those sort of contextual elements that are going to allow you to prioritize. Because if you just sort of have a big pile of alerts or findings and it's not that you can't necessarily trust the vendor who's creating those alerts to say like high, medium, or low, but you're always going to have an organizational context. Like it's probably going to be more impactful if, say, somebody in finance is phished versus, maybe somebody in a different org that doesn't have access to sensitive systems. So being able to not just understand that context, and when I say operationalize it, I mean being able to, like, in real time, access that data to enrich your workflows. I always think about the classic sort of anti-pattern is when, back in the old days of security, we would say run a vulnerability scan and the output would be like a 75-page PDF document, and we would just hand it over. And there's nothing you can really do with that except read it and do your own rationalization. But when you can get that information, systems that can be accessed in real time and used to help folks make better decisions, I think that's when you start to, because again, we all know that we need to prioritize and we can't do everything, but unless you have an environment that actually allows you to practice that, I think you're always going to be struggling. So I like to start from that point of view where we think of security as a context problem, and how do I get more context about my environment and what's happening and what's important to do, and who do I contact about particular issues. Those are sort of precursors to being able to effectively respond and operate.
If I may interject on this point, right? This is exactly where me experiencing this problem as a security solution vendor versus Jason's experience as a practitioner. So, indeed for us, and I made this journey many years ago, I would get into a discussion and I would say, whoa, you must have a CMDB that has all the answers to your context issues. And I would not necessarily get a very positive and affirmative answer. And then I would go ahead and say, oh, in that case, you must have. So how do you, let's say, large enterprise, right? When everything is small, the context problem is easily solvable. But in large enterprises that have developed over the years and still maintain a number of generations of a technology, because that's how it works, how do you even approach at getting this context? Because everybody knows they need to do it. Very few know how to actually get there, and it's not for the fault of their own.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it does capture reality. Right, we love to be notified every time a new system comes online, every time a new vendor comes up. but I think for me, it's sort of I think about if you sort of agree that security is a context problem and understanding, and then there's the sort of reality of what your environment looks like, and then there's like how much do you understand about it, right? So then there's always a little bit of gap between what's reality and what's your view of reality. And to some degree, I think that gap is like an expression of your organizational risk tolerance, right? Like how much are you comfortable not knowing? Because in like a really high assurance environment, you're probably going to rely on more like linear approval processes, sort of gates, and everybody's got to be in the loop. And then when you perhaps have a higher velocity environment, you're willing to take more risk. You're willing to sort of intentionally distribute decision making. And then, so the security team has to almost adopt this view of like what I would refer to as like eventual security, right? We talk about eventual consistency, but I think eventual security is you're understanding that the environment's always changing, and you are going to collect context and sort of continue to update your view of the world. So like if I were to use that, say like an asset management perspective or like an estate management, I need to know all the vendors, all the physical facilities, all the systems applications. I think about, well, who are the sources of truth for that information? And maybe it's finance or it's legal or it's your engineering team. So figure out how do you plug into those systems and, be able to, because again, I don't want to rely on like, hey, I need to have my friend at legal tell me about all the new deals or over in mergers and acquisitions. Like, so you need to be able to like in real time access that information and be able to continuously update your, because back in the old days, the CMDB was probably like a spreadsheet, and that goes out of date pretty much immediately. So I'm always looking at ways of how can I how can I populate my understanding of the environment, but then make sure it's refreshed. And then over time, you find new sources of context you care about. You figure out how do you leverage that and integrate it. And then over time, you sort of know more and more, and then your understanding of reality and reality itself hopefully starts to converge. And I would say it's probably never equivalent, right? And I think that's, in most organizations, it's probably okay, because then that means you're allowing a certain freedom of movement and operation without security getting in the way, which I think is a big key.
Yeah. Now, on the subject of context here, I know to get a lot of context, it usually requires some amount of cybersecurity spend or budget. And going into 2023, where we're all concerned about cutbacks, budget cutbacks on cybersecurity, how do you prioritize between people, technology, or other systems to allow you to have the context and to have the tools and the people to be effective at your role? And again, this one's for you, Jason.
Sure. Yeah, I think, it's always, I would tell people often, like at Netflix, in my 10 years of hiring at Netflix, I never actually could meet my hiring targets. So security people are always they're always hard to find. And then of course, when budgets tighten up and you start to lose a little more flexibility. So for me, when I think about budgeting forward, and it's going to be some combination of tech and process and people and, hiring, education, all those kinds of things. I always like to, if someone were going to come with me and say, hey, we need more people, we need more money, I'm always, I think that's reasonable, but like this idea of, well, return on investment is tough, right? So I want to see some evidence. Like I would want to look back and say, well, last year, what were our hypotheses about, hey, this investment in this control is going to have this outcome? Like maybe last year you invested in, I don't know, finding secrets in source code, and you felt like that was going to reduce the number of incidents you had. And then, well, was that true? Like, did that actually, were you able to connect the dots between an investment and an outcome? So for me, I like to see evidence of that. I like to have an understanding of, I also want to know how completely do we feel like we've already integrated and optimized our current stack. So if I've got 10 tools now, are they all at like, say, 50% implementation? And like we just sort of forgot about it, or are they all at 100%? We've completely optimized it, we've integrated it kind of to the Leonid's point, because we got to get these systems talking to each other, right? You can't live with these silos. All the value is unlocked by integrating. So that's the kind of, I want to know, well, how has our intuition, how has our understanding been about what our investments are going to pay off on? And then are we actually doing what we committed to previously? Like, have we tuned these things? Have we integrated them? Have we completed the implementation?
Yeah, and on that topic here, I know Leonid's expertise is around really increasing that ROI and reducing the complexity of the tools and the threat management. So from your perspective, Leonid, how would you go and assist people like Jason with these problems at hand?
So, in many ways, people tend to see the problem of having to deal with a lot of information, events, whatever, as a fundamental headcount problem. Oh, I don't have enough headcount, we need more people, etc. To a certain extent, indeed, more people achieve more targets, right? It's not completely out of the context, but here is an interesting thing that we've seen a lot. How efficient are these people, right? And it's indeed a question of how efficiently do they utilize the existing stack, but it is also a matter of almost mentality or approach of these people, right? Do people set a goal for themselves to utilize their time, to utilize their stack, to utilize their budgets efficiently? And a lot of studies have shown that there are almost more efficiencies to be gained by looking at the processes we're doing, how we're utilizing the tools, than by saying, hey, let's double the headcounts, they'll do twice as much. So in that point, right, Dallas, to your original question, yeah, we are in 2023. Indeed, it probably will be very unpopular to say that we are cutting down on a security budget, but on the other end, needs to act rationally, and we definitely are not going to be able to actually get higher budgets. But the amount of threats will not wait for when we have the budget or when the economy improves. As a matter of fact, probably it will actually grow more because of many financially well-doing companies being attractive targets in this economy. So the question is the ageless, how do we do more with less, right? And this actually is to an extent, a socio-technical question, because yes, you could ask, how can I get me smarter tools? How can I get me more connected tools? So I'll do more with my existing headcount or with a smaller growth. Yes, but it is also a social question. How do I train my people? How do I enable my people? How do I create a culture among my people where they are asking themselves, not only what did I do today to solve the security issues at my desk, but also what did I do today in order to handle hopefully the same or a growing amount of issues more efficiently tomorrow. And this actually is where we see, and we get to talk to a lot of organizations in lots of verticals. And believe it or not, there is, what's the correlation between, hey, what's the size of your security team versus what are you managing to do it? We've seen smaller security teams achieve vastly greater goals than larger, but not necessarily efficient or forward-thinking security teams. So to those of you who are under constraints of headcount or hiring budgets, I want to say almost like, worry not, there are really good outcomes to be achieved without doubling or significantly growing your budget. And it has been proven. It's not me dreaming about it. So that is sort of like my very initial hunch, again, based on conversations with real organizations.
And on that note, this one's for you here, Jason. So I know you were looking for a lot of different solutions to really allow your teams to double their efficiency, gain more leverage. There's a lot of security automation tools that you've probably used. How did you utilize automation and even integrating your tools together to do more with less, especially in these times?
Sure. Yeah, I think, at Netflix, we were definitely pretty well known for a lot of like our tool contributions, and we open sourced quite a lot. I think when I was there, like 30 something tools, including some early orchestration tools. So yeah, we were totally bought in on automation. I think, Dallas, to your point and Leonid's point around leverage, I think it's important for security leaders to think of themselves, generally security teams are what I would call a central team to an organization. So think about like HR or your facilities team. And for central teams need to be efficient. You can't grow, like you have to grow central teams sublinear to the growth of your organization. Otherwise, frankly, I would say you're not doing your job, right? Because central teams are support functions. You can't be growing faster than your organization. It's just not sustainable. So with automation, one of the things that we would really look for, I mean, there's the sort of easy stuff where like the repeatable stuff you do all the time. And I think those are really great places for folks to start. But as we really started to hit our stride, the kinds of problems that we would look for would be, and we would try to take like historical context of security teams, because I would say Netflix is a very product-led company. We did a lot of work with engineering. And I would say for folks that have been on the operational side of security, you probably had like headbutts with your engineering organizations in the past. So you may have been in organizations where the security team was sort of avoided or wasn't listened to, or didn't have respect. So I would say we kind of looked at what are the things where we could invest in automation that would basically calm and solve like really long-standing problems that would improve the relationships we had with other aspects of the other organization. So I think about one of our really early investments was around how we managed like SSL certificates. And SSL certificates is one of those boring things that nobody really wants to deal with, but when they expire or have a problem, like they causes outages. So, and we would look at those kinds of problems that are like, they're kind of painful. And if we can invest there, they make everybody's lives easier. So that's what we were tended to look for, is like, what could we invest in that would have an impact, not just on our own efficiency, but overall organizational efficiency, and potentially I would always look at like the interface between two organizations, say engineering and security. If I can create some consistency there and sort of like de-escalate any tension there, and a lot of times you can do that with tooling to like simplify that interface. That's one of the ways I felt like we had the most success and impact. It was when we looked at those really long-standing hard problems, and especially by investing there, if we could improve the relationship. Because then it's one of those things where, hey, we're going to invest one place, but it's going to improve organizational health on a bunch of different dimensions. And I think that's what leaders are always looking for, is when you can invest one way and have it pay off in multiple areas.
Yeah, and on the topic of using centralized teams like that and using automation and other tools to really expand across different departments, Leonid, from your perspective, I know you've been doing a lot of different integrations of, let's say, with security operations, DevOps, and so forth. How did you find you could bridge the gap or create bridges for these teams to work more collaboratively together?
So first and foremost, getting back to how things maybe changed in recent years, if I look at the beginning of my career, I was a firewall guy, and a lot of, let's call it remediation, containment, resolution of network security issues ended up being closing or opening some sort of firewall ports, right? All those days are long gone, right? And that's sort of like point number one on these bridges. You being a security practitioner today, many times are very, very, very dependent on the DevOps people, on the business application owner people, on the IT ops people, etc., to deliver the outcome you are hired to deliver. This is just the nature of modern architectures, with the benefit of shift left involving actual developers in this game. Before that, IT people and cloud ops people and others were already in it. And that's first and foremost puts the problem at a much bigger pedestal, right? I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe more, 20 years ago, if I was a security guy, I could do well without the bridges, right? I don't have to be very sociable. I can do my work, and the organization will be in a good shape. Not anymore. This central role just cannot achieve its goal without building the bridges, building the relationship, making non-primarily security roles your ambassadors, etc. So first of all, out of necessity, that would be the summary. Now, let's talk a bit about how does that necessity get translated, because just necessity doesn't get you anywhere, right? Other role players in the organization have other priorities. Sure, waving your hands in the air and shouting, "Oh my God, we have a security incident," gets you some attention and forces people to collaborate with you. But if you do it too often, well, guess what? You will kind of lose credibility and the desire of people to collaborate with you. So how do you, first of all, potentially generate a lesser friction, right? How do you interact with these people using their tools? You integrate using configuration management, collaboration tools, ticketing tools, etc., etc. How do you, as a security person, fit into the processes of your developers, DevOps, IT, business app owners, etc., etc., etc.? That is a very important fundamental part. Yes, technically, you need to integrate with these systems. Practically, you need to make the user experience of involving these people into security decisions very native for them, and so on. That is one side of the medal. The other side of the medal, and well, maybe it's a very basic psychology, the biggest motivator for people to do something is within. What's in it for me? And quite frankly, if security bridge with these role players that we all mentioned is built properly, there's quite a lot of it for them to collaborate well. For example, let's take the DevOps and the developers. Their basic desire is to roll out business capabilities faster, roll them out stable, etc., etc. Does this necessarily have to expose the organization to horrible, horrible, horrible security risks? No, not if it's done properly and collaboratively. So security could and has the mandate to slow these things down, block these things, etc. And that's the weapon for people whose currency is rolling things out quickly. Let's talk about, I don't know, people ops, onboarding quick contractors, providing people access to sensitive information that is required for their roles, but is not to be shared freely, etc., etc. So what's in it for these people? Again, they want tasks achieved as frictionless, as efficiently as possible, collaborating with security, building joint processes, making sure they are streamlined, making sure there is visibility, auditing every sort of like aspect of the process that security operators need. That's the WIFM. So quite frankly, like I said, this bridge, just like any bridge, has two ends, and whether is one of them is frictionless within your tools, within your processes, and the other one is actually providing you value. You don't just do it for me because I'm a security guy and hey, you need to work with a security guy, but you actually get a lot of positive impacts on collaborating with me on your outcomes. That's the biggest motivator.
And then, or go ahead, Jason.
So sorry. Yeah, I was just going to add a little bit to Leonid's earlier point of, we want to engage with folks where they're at and with the tools they're familiar with. And I use that example of how we used to hand over a PDF and maybe today we file a ticket, and I think that's better. That's certainly better. But I would also recommend that security teams imagine a world where we can auto remediate, like the team doesn't even need to be involved because we fix it on their behalf. And I think that's really when you talk about leverage and allowing not just the security team to focus, but your internal teams that you're partnering and collaborating with. I think that's a great vision to have. And I think to sort of unlock that kind of vision, you have to be able to think beyond just sort of incremental improvement and think, hey, what are the things that are really, really going to allow us to jump forward rather than just sort of keep pace? Because I think and not every decision and investment can get you there, but I think in addition to incremental improvements, you have to have some bigger bets that you feel are going to really pay off in that way.
Perfect. That makes sense. So I know we asked the audience to ask a variety of questions, and the Q&A is still open right now. So I'm just going to read a couple of the questions that we actually had here. And the first question from the audience was, what type of metrics are most effective to include in a business case to justify more people and in many cases, better cybersecurity tooling? And I'll pass out to both of you.
Jason, would you like to take a swipe at it first?
Yeah, sure. I would probably go back to the earlier discussion point of, well, what if I'm thinking about the future? Well, how have our intuitions and our estimates in the past, have they been accurate? So are the interventions that we implemented last year, did they have the outcomes that we expected? That's what I would want to know before I would say, hey, let's do more of this. Because if somebody said, hey, we need to add to the SecOps team, or we need to add to the AppSec team, I would want to understand. And this is not getting to necessarily a specific metric, but if I were going to use AppSec as an example or a sort of proxy to how I would think about this problem, I would say, what are the external measures that are giving you the sense that you need to grow, right? So maybe it's the developer population is growing. Maybe we just onboarded a new cloud service provider, so things are becoming more complex. Maybe we have more applications or new product features. So I would want to understand, what are you tying your growth to? But then again, I also want to hear, what is your plan to be able to grow sublinear to that external factor? Because I can't just say, hey, the company grew by 10%, so I need to grow my security team by 10%, because that is just not sustainable. So I want to know, what are you tying your growth to? And then what are your strategies and intuitions and hypotheses that you want to test out to allow you to achieve that sublinear growth? So those are the kind of things I would want to look at.
I'll try to give a couple of examples of our engagement with some organizations and what kind of metrics they looked at. Let's start with an AppSec example, right? Application security, any organization that develops and deploys some sort of a service, B2B, B2C, etc., is bound to have application security issues and is therefore in need of an application security team. But application security is a complicated thing, right? It's these teams are usually consists of pretty experienced architects, people who have deep technological knowledge. So these teams are usually much more difficult to scale, like in comparison to almost anything else. AppSec is just not an entry-level job in any way, shape, or form. Now, so we are engaged with one such organization, a large B2C web service provider. They offer a number of essentially applications that are being continuously updated on a daily basis. And they have a small AppSec team that deals with like almost 20 times larger application development teams that are, in addition to all other troubles, spread across the globe and don't necessarily reside in the same time zone. And one thing that they constantly track is cost and time between detection to resolution. This is their currency. So one of the outcomes they measured as a justification to investing in automation, this is the project we did with them, is how did that particular KPI get impacted? And so we were very happy to see that's an average, and we measured it across a few months, time to resolve shrunk from 2 to 3 weeks into less than a few hours, right? This kind of an proof point. Now, in addition to having more applications, interacting with more teams, etc., is a very clear, measurable, something that you simply cannot argue with. So here's one example, and that's around particular challenging task to scale application security. Let's take a look at something completely different in a very different organization where the initial task was not even accessible by the human beings. This organization, insurance company, interacts a lot with agents, private customers, corporate customers, etc. Vast amounts of the interaction contains sharing data, policies, contracts, particular discounts, etc., etc. All of it is being done by sharing documents with the likes of Microsoft OneDrive, Google Drive, Dropbox, etc., etc., etc. So as a result, an organization has at any given moment tens of thousands of documents with sensitive data sometimes shared with third parties. A very precarious situation to be in if you look at it from the perspective of their data loss prevention program, compliance program, as well as some of the documents contain regulated data. Now, tens of thousands. Let's even theoretically try to imagine what would be the size of the team that would go over all these shared documents, try to contact each and every sharing party, try to understand if it's justifiably shared, should still remain shared, contains just the necessary information for sharing and not something excessive that can just, not humanly processable task. Not so much with an automation, right? They, for example, invested in building very interactive, democratizing automation, where every time somebody shares a document with a third party, which is a part of a legitimate business process, gets a message over their instant messaging, gets a reminder over the data loss prevention policy, asks to categorize this sharing, asks to explain. Then after 30 and 60 days interval, an automation checks, has the external party access this document, and again, reaches back and says, hey, do you still feel it should remain shared, or maybe we'll contain it, etc. Now, the outcome there, right, it's difficult to measure the impact in how many data loss incidents we had in the past versus today. In fact, we would like to have a very round number, 0 data loss incidents. That's the one we are shooting for. But we can measure our own, let's call it exposure. And they, for example, saw that 97%, a whopping amount, in my humble opinion, of what used to be shared did not stay shared. Did it have a negative impact on their business? No, that's the point, right? The business did not get impacted even the slightest bit, but their data security posture, if you will, has got a dramatic improvement. And again, this is a very deterministic measurement. This is my KPI. I invested in that automation. I had absolutely unknown amount of potential problems lurking there. Now I have much more surmountable amount of potential things to audit. So, at the end of the day, and I think, Jason, you actually started talking about adopting automation with this thing, right? Measure, what did you do? How did you change the reality? This is the best sort of like explanation. Once you proved this point, now you can definitely go ahead and tie it to business processes and say, we're launching additional business units, we'll be collaborating with these and those additional external parties, et cetera, et cetera. And it's all based on the fact that here, this is the outcome that we delivered. Now let's extrapolate from this point.
Yeah. Now, with the remaining 3 minutes or so that we have here, I think we have time for one more question, and we'll definitely follow up with the audience members that asked additional questions that we're not able to cover today. This one's for you, Jason. And again, it goes back to cybersecurity budgets. And in 2023, again, we're experiencing many different cutbacks here. So they're wondering what areas provide the best return on investment in cybersecurity.
Oh, geez, you could probably ask 10 people and get 10 different answers. I would say for me, for security teams, I think the rubber really meets the road when an incident happens, right? When something bad, and it doesn't necessarily need to be like a mega breach, but there's some negative event has happened. So I think, like it's always my perspective, I think good security teams aren't afraid of incidents, right? Because they feel confident that they can help the organization manage their way through it effectively and competently. And the reason why I think that's the place to invest is sort of responding to incidents and bringing the organization back to like its stable state, is because that's like the one big thing that you can really lose is this idea of opportunity cost, right? When you have a bunch of people spun up and like worrying about something happening, I think there's so much opportunity lost to the organization of those folks just being able to focus on what their day job is. So I would always say, I always look at like response and recovery as great places to invest, because I think that's where you really want your team to shine and allow the business to continue on confidently.
Perfect. And I think we can answer one more question. We might go a minute or two on overtime here. Prashant asks, Leonid, you mentioned about building frictionless bridges between various teams. Therefore, tools, apps, platforms they're already using. What are some of the biggest challenges for automation tools like Torq to build and more importantly, version control with hundreds of integrations, since managing the hundreds of third-party apps? Can this be an uphill battle?
Wow, first of all, great question. An easy and therefore wrong answer would be, I mean, what do you mean, Prashant? Every tool has an API, it's well documented, it's open. So what's the problem with an integration? And yes, that's a wrong answer, because large enterprises, as we mentioned, have different generations of solutions. Not all of them have accessible APIs. Fortunately or not, as a fact, even many vendors that do provide API don't necessarily provide a good and usable API. So indeed, being able to provide useful integrations to thousands of different tools is a challenge, and this challenge is resolved at least by us, right? I cannot necessarily talk about other automation vendors. The way we approach it is think of it as a pyramid. At the base of a pyramid, you have an essentially technological solution that gives you freedom to interact and build these versions of interacting components using any protocol and being able to plug this in without having to change your core technology. We use cloud native technologies there. Therefore, every integration, every interaction is just a containerized job. We use a very secure container images repository that can get updated, etc. This allows, and we'll talk about the sort of like higher layers of the pyramid, but this very simple technological thing saying that no integration is hard-coded, no, it's not a part of, no, we don't have how do you call it, plugins, add-ons, content packs. Many people invent all kinds of words, meaning you take additional code and, pardon my French, shove it in your product. We don't have these. And that's enablement. Now, what do you do with this enablement? Sure. On top of this enablement, we have a content team that operates on cycles that are completely different from the actual product's core team, whose sole purpose is to work and A, build, B, maintain. By the way, maintain how? With automation. That's the only way, because these products, they change underneath. And no, as much as I'd like to be able to update it when interfaces break, guess what? It's not going to happen. So the only way to detect it in time is to build not only the actual Knator, but to constantly automate it. And that is our own content team. But wait, that is not enough. You said it, there is, sure, there are the, let's call it the usual suspects that you would find in a technological stack of pretty much every decent enterprise, but that there's a long tail of things that no single content team in the world could ever cover. So on top of that, we provide very easy no-code tools for the actual organizations to, in essence, develop their own integrations. But we said there is no coding, so it's not develop. Let's call it define integrations, right? After they are defined using very no-code experience, they can be contributed back and added to the interaction cycles of the content team if the organization so desires. They can remain completely private and serve just one organization. That is also an option. So this pyramid consisting of a fundamental technology that allows you high velocity of developing and testing integrations, B, a in-house team that does that, specializing on the priorities of our users, etc. C, full, socialization, right? Kind of like democratization, right? There's nothing special. The same tools that our content team has, we also offer to our users, and many of the organizations indeed use them because they are frictionless, etc. So this pyramid of three actually allows us to be able to handle a very large amount of integrations and to keep them constantly up to date thanks to the automation. And again, we've been doing it for the past at least 3 years, and we've covered thousands of different integrations, and it is a working model. Of course, constantly scaling, constantly covering new solutions. That's how at least we approach it. Can't speak for the others.
That's awesome. So, hey, I just want to thank everyone once again for attending this webinar today and sticking with us for an extra 5 minutes to hear some of the amazing Q&A at the end here. We're also going to follow up with some of the attendees for additional questions that were asked here. So with that, I just want to thank Jason and Leonid for your time today and everyone else on attending this call. And with that, we're going to wrap up the webinar. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day, everyone.